Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Bushra Hussain. I'm the Artistic Director of the Karachi Biennale Trust. After a very successful first day, we are looking forward to an equally engaging session today. The discursive weekend is part of our fourth Karachi Biennale, which was launched on October 27th and will continue till November 10th. If you haven't already visited 5 of our sites, I would definitely request you to engage with the interactive works which have been done by 40 artists from 10 countries. For today's session, we will have two. The first is a talk by 𝐋𝐈𝐁𝐋 titled Food for Thought, Thought for Change, Rashida Arayan's Practice of Transformation. This talk considers the vital role that food has played in Arayan's 70 years long art practice. I would like to call upon and invite Saira Danish, member of the discursive committee, to introduce the speaker.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It is a privilege for me to introduce Dr. 𝐋𝐈𝐁𝐋, who is a researcher, a writer, and a visiting faculty at the Faculty of Sciences and Arts and Sciences at the Aga Khan University. Dr. 𝐋𝐈𝐁𝐋 recently completed a PhD at the University of Manchester on the works of Rashida Arayan between 1950s Karachi and 1970s London, which she is currently turning into a monograph. Her writing has appeared in publications including Art History, Art Margins, New German Critique, Efflux Criticism, to name a few. I would now like to welcome Dr. 𝐋𝐈𝐁𝐋 to speak on her topic. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you so much to Nilofer and to the Karachi Biennial organizers for welcoming me to this event. I'm very sorry not to be joining you in person. I was hoping to, but unfortunately, due to a change of plans, I'll have to join you online. So, as mentioned in the summary of my talk, my aim today is to explore how the decades-long practice of the Karachi-born, London-based artist Rashida Arayan speaks powerfully to this year's biennial theme of risk, encompassing food security, ecological sustainability, cultural heritage, and social justice. Through Rashid's practice, I think we can begin to bring both historical and contemporary perspectives on this theme to bear on the timely, if not urgent, conversations ongoing this weekend and over the course of the biennial. At the same time, and following conversations with Nilofer, I'd like to also offer a narrative of Arayan's practice and its plural dimensions, spanning his work in art making, engineering, writing, publishing, curation, and activism, and to propose that these various elements of his career, and indeed his food-related work, are all linked by his deep interest and commitment to artistic, social, political, and scientific processes of transformation. So to give a brief overview of my talk, I'll begin with Arayan's long-running project Shamiana, a fully functioning restaurant, first initiated in 2017. And I'll then locate this project in the long trajectory of Arayan's practice, moving backwards throughout his multiple stages and considering the place of food within it. And in doing so, I hope to consider Arayan's own claim for the way that his food-related work disrupts the temporalities, geographies, and disciplinary boundaries of classical art and art history. So I'll speak for about 45, maybe just over 50 minutes, and then we'll open up to conversation. So to begin with Shamiana, this work was initiated in Kotsia Square in Athens, Greece, one of the exhibition sites of Documenta 14, which was uniquely held in Athens as well as the traditional location of Kassel that year. Athens at the time was struggling with the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, as well as the responsibility of hosting large numbers of refugees from the Syrian civil war. And it was for Documenta 14's curators a cipher of the so-called Global South. And presenting the exhibition across these two cities was intended, albeit not without controversy, as a decentering and perhaps decolonizing gesture. Within Athens, Shamiana was further placed within a square named after the mayor Konstantinos Koutsias, who was responsible for building a Bauhaus housing complex for Greek refugees. And these spatial residences, I believe, were fitting for a project by an artist who has singularly dedicated himself, as Orion has, to the project of challenging the Eurocentric and racist exclusions of art institutions, as well as to the utopian universalism promised by modernist movements such as Bauhaus. Named for the shamiana often used for meals and weddings in Pakistan, Orion's contribution to Documenta 14 was this fully functioning restaurant. It served over the course of over the course of Documenta, simple, delicious meals cooked by the Greek NGO organization Earth that were free of charge to Documenta visitors and wider publics. The structure of this communal eating space comprised block-color canopies arranged in a grid-like formation, with dividing walls painted with a chromatic diamond pattern. By sitting down together to share a meal, according to the artist's concept for the work, visitors could also share perspectives and ideas specifically for social change. And since its initial presentation at Documenta 14, Shamiana has become both an itinerant concept and, in London, a physical site of community. It has been presented in this regard as a temporary installation, most recently in 2023 at Tate Modern in London, alongside the exhibition of Orion's work Zero to Infinity. And it has also existed, as we see here, as this fully functioning, although intermittently open, restaurant in London's Stoke Newington neighborhood. And its opening actually coincided, opportunely enough, with the start of my PhD in 2019. And so I was extremely fortunate to be able to spend significant amounts of time in Shamiana, witnessing its transformations and its community dynamics over these handful of years. And the space, as we see here, is replete with artistic elements that layer multiple aspects of Orion's practice, which I'll unpack further in just a minute. But first, I wanted to speak briefly to my own experience of the space during the times that I visited. And the first point I'd like to emphasize is the collective effort and community at the core of the space's operations. Shamiana is Orion's concept, certainly, but its daily operations have been managed by his studio team, Majella Dowdican and Peter Fillingham in particular, as well as its many chefs and waitstaff. And the experience of the space also varied significantly according to the group of people activating it at any given time. There have been regular art parties, as we see here, which were open to general publics, but typically attended by Orion's broad network of friends and acquaintances. There are also workshops and dinners for art students in London, as well as workshops on food sustainability by London food justice activists. I led a class myself on Shamiana for my art history students at the University of Manchester, and I've also just gone there on Friday night for dinner with friends. So Shamiana has functioned as many things: art world hub, activist space, pedagogical tool, and neighborhood restaurant. The most generative and dynamic period of the space, in my mind, was during the difficult years of COVID-19, when many public spaces were closed due to quarantining measures. During this time, Shamiana began offering free meals, sometimes as takeaways when public spaces were closed, and other times in person when this was possible. You could still purchase items like drinks or other or different food options, but in general, Shamiana was offering just one simple, delicious free meal. And this free meal created, I think, a certain level of general accessibility and opened up the space to its neighborhood in new ways, while at the same time Shamiana's conjunction to various worlds, such as the art world or social justice group, also brought in and kind of circulated specific publics. So without idealizing the space as one that resolved existing social inequalities or antagonisms, I'd argue that it did succeed at various points in its existence in creating a kind of universal element, here being a function of the free meals, that was at the same time suspended in dynamic motion, or the circulation of different individuals and publics. And I think this idea of a kind of dynamic universality, we might say a universality that exists in and through its transformations or translations, is really something at the core of Arendt's practice. In addition to positing that Shamiana realized this core concept of Arendt's practice, this concept of transformation and dynamic universality, I also believe we can read the space as a palimpsest of his multifaceted career, one that layers forms and practices that have defined Arendt's work at various points, and to which he has repeatedly returned, reworked, and reinvented in response to specific sociopolitical contexts. So, moving through Shamiana in the manner of a palimpsest, I'd like to travel backwards chronologically and begin to unpack these various elements, beginning from Arendt's recent work and ending in his early work as a self-taught artist and engineering student in 1950s Karachi. So immediately within Shamiana's wall installations, murals, stained glass, and bright colors, we can see the forms of his Opus series, which we see here on the left, as well as a series of lattice works seen on the right that he created at the same period. And the Opus series, as we can see, comprised chromatic diamond-shaped geometric patterns begun in 2014. Alongside both the Opus series and lattice works, Arendt also initiated his Homecoming series. And this was a series of works, in fact, debuted in Karachi in 2014 with a show at the VM Gallery, brilliantly curated by Amra Ali, who has also written strikingly about Arendt's connection to food in several essays herself. The exhibition at VM Gallery presented these Homecoming works alongside others spanning the trajectory of Arendt's career. So it may, of course, be familiar to some of you here. The exhibition, in this Homecoming series, we see the same commitment to color and geography as the Opus works, but we also see an investigation of calligraphy. And the work we see here is titled Guftagoo 1, a discussion between al-Biruni and Ibn Sina about Aristotle, referencing a famous conversation between the two Muslim philosophers in which al-Biruni challenged the Aristotelian cosmology of Ibn Sina by advocating a scientific method of empirical observation and experimentation. And as this painting and its title exemplifies, the Homecoming series comprised an intellectual and visual interpretation of and homage to key thinkers of 11th and 12th century Islamic philosophy. Arendt has made his thinking around these series explicit in a series of articles that he wrote beginning in 2010 and later published in his recent book, Islam and Modernism. And as Arendt argues in these texts and describes in these texts, his interest in these works is locating an intellectual and historical link between the connection between the history of discourses on the connection between reason and relevation in Islamic philosophy, and the prevalence of geometric patterns in Islamic art and architecture. In Arendt's understanding, this prevalence of geometry relates not to any kind of quote-unquote ban on images that is frequently and wrongly attributed to Islam, but rather to a refusal to picture the divine in human form, and thus an affirmation of speculative and spiritual modes of thought accessible through abstraction. So if Orine's Homecoming series articulates a historical and intellectual link between geometry and rationalist thought and Islamic philosophy via calligraphy, the Opus series articulates this connection through geometry. And this is brought into sharp relief in Orine's 2018 site-specific commission for the atrium of the Aga Khan Center in London, which houses the Institute of Ismaili Studies, as well as the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations, the gallery, and the Aga Khan Foundation. We see here Orine's lattice structure, spanning the atrium's 37-meter length, patterned with the distinctive geometry of the Opus series. And in the context of this building dedicated to progressive intellectual inquiry into Muslim thought and culture, this work clearly signals a link between these pursuits and geometric abstraction. At the same time, through its commitment to geometric abstraction, the Opus series and its related works also asserts a connection between abstraction and rational, critical, or speculative thought at a higher level of generality and thus perhaps universality or accessibility. Orine informed me himself that the Opus series actually initially emerged out of a reflection on the patterns of floor tiling used in the quotidian context of kitchens and households. And in addition to this everyday material, we can also see formal resemblance to the geometric abstractions of 20th century European avant-gardes. A reference that is made explicit in Orine's 2015 lattice work, which we see here, which pays direct homage to Kazimir Malevich's suprematist paintings of the early 1900s, such as Black Square and Red Square, which we see here. And in doing so, these series of geometric abstractions decenter the European modernist break with figurative representation in its turn to non-objective art. The critical, rationalist, and speculative impulses of modernist art becomes here not an exclusive patrimony of European artists, as classical art history would have it, but rather a universal capacity connected to a plurality of knowledges and histories through a cosmic perspective. Okay, so it might seem that we've now traveled quite a way from food and Shamiana, but I believe that this context is in fact essential for understanding the significance of Shamiana's architectural surrounds. The chromatic geometric patterns that encompass diners as they share meals at Shamiana are not merely beautiful patterns, but rather aesthetically pleasing decor that foregrounds this universal capacity for critical thought. These wall-mounted lattices and murals also blur the distinction between art and architecture, challenging the boundaries of the European tradition of autonomous art by opening it up to functionality and constructive use, in line with both the European avant-gardes as well as Muslim and South Asian histories of craft, architecture, and visual culture. Shamiana as an artwork is not a collection of objects then, but an environmental catalyst for collective discussion that mobilizes everyone's individual capacity for critical thought towards new imaginations of our shared world. Hence the subtitle, Food for Thought, Thought for Change. So while Shamiana was first realized in 2017, the concept behind the project has a much longer history. We can step backwards now to 1986, when Orine first submitted a proposal to the Art Angel Trust for a project for an open submission contest that would send works to the 1986 Venice Biennial. In an unpublished text titled Food and Art, Orine describes his Venice Biennial proposal as comprising 3 distinct yet interconnected works, which involved collecting discarded food and food byproducts such as bones from butcher shops, preparing and serving a meal from these collected materials in a city square in Venice, and then collecting the leftover materials to transform into sculptural installations. one in the shape of a straight line and the other arranged in a circle. And we can see here an excerpt from Arendt's proposal itself to the Art Angel Trust. Excuse me. Although the proposal was rejected at the time, Arendt realized a version of the work several years later in 1988, when he was invited to present a solo exhibition at the Showroom Gallery in London titled "When the Innocent Begins to Walk the Earth." His contribution to this exhibition comprised the two works that we see here: Arctic Circle on the left, made of empty alcohol bottles arranged in a circle, and A White Line Through Africa on the right, comprising an assembled line made of bleached bones. Arendt's process of creating the work only partially followed the structure of what he'd proposed to the Art Angel Trust. It realized Arendt's vision for a sculptural installation constructed from discarded food and beverage waste, yet it lacked the communal, participatory, and sensory aspects of cooking and sharing a meal. I believe that this shift in Arendt's original proposal did highlight, however, part of the artistic and political stakes of his engagement with food. And to unpack this further, I'd like to consider the critical dialogue that these two works stage with the work of British artist Richard Long and the canonical Euro-American histories of conceptual art. So as we can see here by looking at these two works by Richard Long, a major figure of conceptual and land art, Arendt's Arctic Circle and White Line Through Africa critically appropriate and comment on Long's two earlier works, A Circle in Africa from 1977, seen on the left, and A Line Made by Walking from 1967. Richard Long was among a generation of British conceptual artists who had studied at London's art school Central St. Martin's in the mid-1960s, and whose work critically negated the formalist and object-based traditions of modernist sculpture taught by Central St. Martin's professors, such as Anthony Caro, the British sculptor who was himself a major point of reference for Arendt in the 1960s. In Long's 1967 A Line Made by Walking was an early and canonical work in the artist's challenge to modernist conventions. The work exists as a photographic documentation of a line that the artist made by traipsing forwards and backwards in a meadow on London's southern edge. In this work, the weighty mass of traditional sculpture is dissolved and extended spatially and temporally into an ephemeral line produced through a perambulatory act. Created in the mid-1960s, Long's act of walking intersected with avant-garde and countercultural practices, such as the situationist dérive, while also enacting a provocative challenge to the modernist art object and its commercial status as a sellable object. In the 1970s, Long's conceptual and land art work had then expanded to walks pursued in various locations across Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia, which he marked through lines or assemblages of organic objects in circles, such as seen in his Circle Through Alaska. And these were often and increasingly institutionally framed by museums and galleries as forms of sculpture, in fact, in direct conflict with the artist's original challenge to modernist objective. In Arendt's critical appropriations of Long's works, the elegant pile of driftwood in Arctic Circle is replaced here by a sphere of empty alcohol bottles, a gesture that Arendt described as evoking the presence of alcoholism among Native people in Alaska as a consequence of their ongoing socioeconomic dispossession in the U.S., dating back to American settler colonialism and the genocide of Native Americans. In White Line Through Africa, similarly, the ephemeral tracks of Long's footsteps are supplanted by a trail of bleached bones, articulating a scathing commentary on the death and destruction wrought in Africa by European colonialism. And through this use of food detritus, the work foregrounds the forced absence of nourishment and conviviality, so characteristic of a shared meal, that results from colonial violence. And such a commentary, of course, resonates with the history of the Bengal famine as well, discussed yesterday by my colleague Emilia Teresiano. Sorry, I'll stay on this slide for a second. So, Orine's works critique Long for naively and uncritically enacting a colonial operation himself, by seeing himself as a kind of Robinson aid, a heroic individual leaving marks of modern art in an untouched world, while failing to recognize, or worse, disavowing, the existence of other people and knowledges in the environments through which he freely traipsed. And in this same gesture, Orion also critiqued the international art system that had canonized Long's work for its imbrication with and complicity in imperial processes of resource extraction and dispossession. During the same period, Orion's critique of dominant metropolitan art practices and discourses was realized at a collective scale with his founding of the journal Third Text in 1987. The journal's title clearly makes reference to the political standpoint and project of the Third World, a term initially coined by French scholar Alfred Sauvy to refer to countries unaligned with the two Cold War blocs of Allied forces or Soviet Russia, and also charged with the decolonial aspirations of the 1955 Bandung Conference, where heads of African and Asian states converged to discuss how recently decolonized countries could organize economically just futures beyond the existing models of the First and Second World. And in Third Text, Orion set out to galvanize a collective discourse among artists and thinkers who could critique, as stated in the journal's opening editorial quoted here, the discourses of the metropolitan center from its peripheries, or those who occupied the third position of the Third World. Such a peripheral or third position, the editorial makes clear, is not only a geographic question, but also a relational one. And as Orion experienced himself again and again in London through the racism that pervaded his daily life and institutional experiences in the colonial metropole, one could well be peripheral within the so-called center. And it was through this impactful critical project that one of the most significant journals of art and interdisciplinary theory since the post-war period emerged. As the name of Third Text also signaled, this project emerged out of the longer political legacies of Third Worldist anti-imperialism, in which Orion was actively involved during his years in London in the 1970s. And it was this context to which Orion actually traces the origins of his artistic engagement with food. The site of this early intersection of art and food was Artists for Democracy, or AFD, an experimental collective founded in opposition to the US-backed military coup against Salvador Allende's democratically elected Popular Unity government in Chile in 1973. AFD first came together by organizing the Festival for Democracy in Chile to raise funds and awareness about the coup and funds to support democratic groups opposing the coup, which was presented in October 1974 at London's Royal College of Arts. The group subsequently reorganized after an early schism under the leadership of Orion's friend David Madala at a squatted building in central London, where AFD mounted self-organized exhibitions and festivals in solidarity with liberation struggles and people's wars in Vietnam, Lusophone Africa, China, and indigenous movements in North America. Lacking any formal source of funding, AFD was perpetually struggling to maintain its activities. and as an active member of the group, Orion began cooking a meal of curry and rice for open gatherings hosted on Sundays, which were sold for a small fee to raise funds. These culinary contributions were not indeed intended as art. Rather, they foreground the making and sharing of food as precisely a site where the institutionally bounded distinctions between art, politics, and conviviality break down into a constructive practice of life. This engagement with food did explicitly migrate into Orion's practice in 1978, just at the time that AFD broke up after being evicted from its space. And at this time, the artist began conceptualizing an artwork involving cooking and eating food with his family. During that year, Orion conducted a performance at his house in Karachi, coinciding with the festival of Eid al-Adha. For this event, as the artist has recounted, he and his brother Majid ceremonially killed a goat, prepared and cooked the meat, and ate this Eid meal with their family, all documented photographically by their younger sisters. Orion subsequently arranged the photographs in a grid sequence with text in Urdu and English, running right to left following the conventions of Urdu and contrary to the conventions of English. As a performance documented photographically, the work plays with the borders between quotidian life, ritual practice, and artistic production. And through its documentation and use of a narrative in multiple scripts, written and one that is only partially accessible to English speakers who don't read Urdu, the work also plays with the cultural assumptions and literacies of its multiple possible audiences, challenging the stereotypes and othering that Orion faced as a Muslim in Britain. Orion's engagement with food emerged amidst the context of AFD, it was situated in an artistic and political environment where the practices and social organization of food production were understood as pivotal political questions of anti-imperialist and liberation movements. This wider concern at AFD was most directly articulated by a remarkable exhibition mounted by British artist and writer Lynn McRitchie, also an AFD member herself. Titled "The World is a Grain of Sand," as we see here, the exhibition filled AFD's squatted building with images of agriculture and food production, while inviting visitors to dig through the hanging baskets, holding a mixture of grain and grain-sized cut-out pieces of the Financial Times newspaper. And through this participatory action, visitors could discover quotations and poems, as well as statements foregrounding the labor and laborers who produce the food we consume. McRitchie created this installation in 1975 at a time when she and other AFD members, according to her own recollections, were, like many on the European left at the time, enamored with the Maoist politics and its affirmation of peasant political agency, as distinct from the classical Marxist affirmation of the urban proletariat as revolutionary class, which was, of course, sustained only through a lack of awareness or disavowal of the millions of lives lost under the modernization policies of the Great Leap Forward between 1958 and 62, and which, in fact, resulted in one of the largest mass famines in history. Yet, AFD members' awareness of the stakes of food production was not limited to this romanticized Maoism. Other key references included the Guinean agronomist Amilcar Cabral, who led the West African country of Guinea-Bissau's independence struggle against the Portuguese Empire between the 1950s and 1970s. When Cabral spoke in London in 1971, Orion and other AFD members, including David Madalla, Guy Brett, and Jonathan Miles, all attended. As an agronomist, Cabral applied his colonial scientific training to redress colonial agricultural practices, such as the cultivation of groundnuts for export that were depleting the land and soil, and the application of indigenous farming techniques and crops better suited to the local terrain, but also reorganized into non-hierarchical structures led directly by people. This process of translating and transforming colonial scientific tools into ones of liberation is a method that Arain directly referenced and advocated in the realm of art in his well-known text, Preliminary Notes for a Black Manifesto, written in 1975 and later published in the first issue of the journal Black Phoenix that Arain co-founded and co-edited with the Dhaka-born poet and filmmaker Mahmoud Jamal. The journal's title signals its historical connections with Britain's Black Power movement, of which Arain and Jamal were both members in the early 1970s, and under whose umbrella Asian and Afro-Caribbean people both gathered in a broad front against imperial racism. Arain's manifesto, in many ways, articulated the core aims of the journal. And this aim is evident in Arain's quote, which we see on the right here. It was to confront the dominant forms of metropolitan art and culture by critically mediating and transforming them through an engagement with the knowledges and techniques suppressed by colonialism, producing in the process a new liberatory and international avant-garde culture. So, moving back in Arain's practice further to consider his work of the 1960s, it may seem that such directly engaged political participatory practices were a stark break from the abstract and rationalized structural works that he produced shortly after moving from Karachi to London. Whilst working a day job as a civil engineering assistant in the petrochemicals subsidiary of British Petroleum, Arain also innovated a new concept for sculpture based on the symmetrical arrangement of horizontal, vertical, and diagonal elements. These open-faced cubes employ the simple diagonal bracing technique used to reinforce the structural integrity of the petrochemical refinery towers that Arain was also designing for his employer at the time. Or rather, he was supposed to be designing, but as we can see in his use of engineering calculation sheets to devise his new sculptures, he was often busy pursuing art while at the office. And although these works were produced prior to Arain's politicization in the Black Power and Third Worldist movements, and lack their agitational political reference, they nonetheless contained the seeds of his core artistic and political commitment to processes of transformation. And this commitment is evident, I believe, in this short unpublished statement by Arain about his structural works at the time. And I'll just read out the most salient part of this quote here, which you can read in full directly. Arain writes, "I'm only interested in the transformation of the functional structures of technology/engineering into the non-functional visual situation/confrontation so that they could achieve a new awareness when reversed to their original/additional functional capacities." So with this proposition, Arain, I believe, does a few things. On one level, he drives forward a major fracture in the tradition of modernist sculpture by initiating a new concept of art that broke with the modernist conventions of the contemplative viewer to initiate an engaged audience and moved beyond the strictures of medium and object to prioritize concept, process, and everyday experience. Underlying Arain's conception of these structural works, to be more specific, was also the idea that they could dynamically engage an audience to present the technological structures of everyday life in a new, defamiliarized light. They could, in other words, break down our habitual relations to industrial environments and their instrumentalized uses, and enable a new, more creative and constructive engagement with technology. Moving back further, I think we can trace this commitment to transformation back into Orine's days as a civil engineering student and self-taught artist in 1950s and 60s Karachi. And we see here Orine in front of an abstract painting which really captures his interest in processes of transformation at the time. And to elaborate this further, we can look at these two works by Orine in the late 1960s and late 1950s and early 60s that are both clearly preoccupied with such processes. Both works were produced while the artist was in the midst of his civil engineering degree at NED University, yet also increasingly distracted from his studies by his artistic pursuits. In the painting on the right, titled 𝐋𝐈𝐀𝐶, we see a swirl of incendiary colors in a curvilinear pattern snaking down the page, which captures the movement of fire. And fire, of course, is a combustive process that consumes and transforms whatever it encounters. And Orine had in fact employed fire as a technique of artistic production 2 years earlier before this painting, in a work that really comprised an avant-gardist gesture that was not exhibited or received by wider publics at the time, yet is also captured in this reconstructed work, which we see here on the right. And as Orine has recounted in the history of this work, it emerged when he encountered a twisted metal wire on the streets of Karachi in 1959, which, in a flash of insight, he picked up and took home, presenting it to his family as a work of sculpture. And after later realizing that the wire was the aftermath of a bicycle tire burned on a rubbish heap, he decided to recreate the wire's production by throwing several bicycle tires on a fire himself and recovering the wires again as sculpture. And as I said, this work went unwitnessed by wider audiences at the time, but it was later reconstructed in his work titled My First Sculpture. Both this painting and sculpture were produced in the aftermath of Field Marshal Ayub Khan's coup in 1958 in Pakistan, and the start of his so-called Decade of Development, which included the Green Revolution, intended to modernize and industrialize agricultural production. And in this context, it is significant that Orine, an engineer in training, would choose not to participate in the advancement of these developmentalist policies, but rather to focus his energy on employing technical procedures, such as fire, towards the construction of avant-garde art. And I think we can read this gesture, this turn from engineering to art, really as an incipient mode of social critique. Okay, so finally, in just a brief conclusion, I'd like to again assert that these processes of transformation that we've now traced through Orine's decades-long practice is really a core fundamental commitment of his work, and also a fundamental premise underlying his engagement with food. Orine's uses of food to blur the institutional borders of art is also a gesture that we could easily locate art historically in the history of 20th century European avant-garde practices. We could think about this Orine's use of food as part of a legacy that includes futurist banquets, includes restaurants founded by artists such as Daniel Spory in the 1960s, Gordon Matta Clark in the 1970s, as well as Al Ruppersberg also in the 1970s. We could also consider it in line with perhaps the most famous instance of the contemporary artist Rikrit Tiravanesia's presentation of a pad thai dinner in a New York gallery in 1990, which sparked a wide critical debate around the politics and stakes of participatory or relational art at the time. Yet, Rather than situate Iran's use of food strictly within art history and this catalog of avant-gardist repetitions, I think it's more interesting and generative to understand food as a site where politics, in multiple modes and articulations, have entered Iran's practice and initiated again and anew successive processes of transformation. Thank you. Thanks very much, and I'm happy to open up to questions, comments, discussion.
Hi, Kylie. This is Nilofer. How are you doing?
Hi.
Thank you for your wonderfully enlightening talk. We in Karachi who've seen his work from time to time, for us it was very kind of introduced many facets that have been unknown to us. I'd like to ask about the Shamiana and its relationship to the community around it. Is this perceived as an artwork or as a restaurant that just exists in a, in a quirky Rashid Arai fashion? So, because he is known to be quite a, sort of, there's only one Rashid Arai, as you know. So, how do you think the community takes this intervention?
Yes, thank you, Nila, for the question, and it's a great question. I would love to do a survey of the people who have gone into Shamiana over the years. I think that would be a really fascinating project. I haven't done it, but I will say I don't think it's probably evident to everyone who passes by or simply happens to stop in that it is an artwork. This is my speculation, but I think there really are sort of multiple publics that intersect. There is a kind of art public, a knowing art public that understands the history and context of this space, and then there's also kind of everyday passerbys, people who live in the neighborhood, who encounter the space first and foremost probably as a restaurant. And what I thought was so remarkable during the period of the COVID pandemic was I think that the space, at least in my experience, and I can't kind of claim sort of universal standpoint here, but in what I witnessed in my experience, did manage to break down to some extent any barriers that might have emerged from its artistic status. And I think even though you might not know that the space is an artwork, there are elements in the space that kind of make you conscious that it is not simply a normal restaurant, and in fact also in doing so make you a bit uncomfortable. For example, the cubes that we see used as tables, you can't actually put your legs under them because they've got the diagonal, and so it's a bit awkward. And of course the colors and the lighting is really bright. The lighting is kind of like a gallery lighting. And I think these elements are very intentional and on Oriion's part. They're intended to make you conscious of the space in a new way. But also, I know from times when the space was working with a local food justice group, and the food justice group was cooking meals for people who wanted to come for free meals in the neighborhood, that elements of the space were also potentially alienating for the people that they served. So there was definitely tension, potentially conflict that had to be negotiated in this regard. So I think to answer your question, there are ways in which Shamiana, while retaining its artistic character, also I think it was able to create a more open, accessible community kind of environment, and really through the free meals that were offered on a daily basis. And I saw people come in who seemed like they were coming probably quite regularly, seemed quite comfortable in the space, eating at the same time as, people from the Tate. So I think there was a different kind of environment created through the free meals, but the space has not always been completely successful in bridging these multiple publics.
Hi, Kylie. So I was really curious about the project that Rashid Arian wanted to do for the Venice Biennale, but obviously it was rejected. Not obviously, shouldn't have been. But even if it was, did he ever realize it again? Did he go ahead with the project, or was it just shelved? Just curious, because I thought that was quite a unique project, considering that you're just collecting bones from everywhere. And then also, creating a broth out of it, and then creating meals, and people willing to consume it, because obviously you do need to give the disclaimer that these are bones collected. So I was just curious about that project. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. That project has not been realized in the form presented in his initial proposal. In the idea of collecting discarded bones and producing a risotto, I think he proposes. But elements, I think is really common in Arian's practice, elements of that proposal have then made it into successive works, most directly in Shamiana. So there were periods where Shamiana was, I think again, when it was working with this food justice group, a lot of the produce that it was cooking with was produce collected from, I think, supermarkets that was about to be discarded. So there are ways in which this interest in preserving, in preventing food waste, in kind of the economy of food production, in ecological sustainability, have migrated into Shamiana in its various iterations. Whereas the idea of presenting a sculptural installation made of food waste migrated into Arian's showroom project in 1988. So to directly answer your question, the project, to my knowledge, has not been realized in its form exactly, but different elements have been iterated and expanded into his wider practice.
Hi, Kaylee. This is Amra. How are you? I think it's also, like the question of where art begins and where Rashid intends for it not to, be art in that sense. That has been his whole idea, and he talks about the history of idea. And his book, Art Beyond Art, which is on, eco-aesthetics, also has multiple projects that have yet to be visualized or implemented, but they exist in that form because of the hierarchies or the lack of knowledge or and the other thing is, one of the projects I think was his which he presented at Ramal Saab's, which had to do with the involvement of artists in cultivating land. And that was the idea, that it moves beyond, and that was way back in, I think he presented in 2001 or something in Karachi at Suman House. So that idea never really, in fact, there was so much resistance has been to Rashid's idea that it has really not been understood. And it's just been, talked about it. And I think that is why he's been so resilient in extending it beyond, as the Lone Ranger who's been, struggling and is trying to undo, which is where he stands, very much, storming the periphery, So that's just what I wanted to add. That is the nature of, as far as I understand, Rashid's aesthetics. There is no reason for him to connect it to the form, the visual form, right? They exist parallel to each other. So I don't know what you would like to, respond to in that.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Amra. I think that I fully agree with your comment, and I didn't have time to address all of Orine's food-related proposals, but of course you're right. There's a number of there are several collective agricultural proposals in Art Beyond Art, and part of the thinking around Shamiana really emerged from this Venice Biennial proposal through texts published in Art Beyond Art. I didn't know about this presentation in Karachi in 2001, but I'd love to talk to you more about this. And I think you really captured what I was trying to say in my conclusion, which is rather than situate Orine's restaurant within a kind of history of avant-gardist attacks on the separation of art and life, I think it's really pivotal actually to trace where the ideas of his engagement with food are coming from. And that's, I think this longer trajectory really goes through, as I tried to trace, anti-colonial, third worldist movements and real live struggles, such as the ideas and writings and practices of Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau. So I think you're absolutely right that this commitment to ideas that traverse the boundaries of art, political worlds, intellectual worlds, is really pivotal to Orine's practice and something that is particularly stark in his engagement with food.
I don't think there are any more questions, Kylie. And thank you very much again. This wonderful talk. And let's keep in touch, all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.